Something strange is happening to the internet right now, and almost nobody is talking about it. People who use Linux, an operating system that has always represented freedom, privacy, and control, are starting to run into invisible walls online. Websites suddenly asking for things Linux cannot provide. Services refusing access. Platforms blocking users unless they verify themselves in ways that simply do not work properly on Linux systems. At first, these problems look random. A broken page here, a failed verification there. But when you connect all the pieces together, a much bigger story starts to appear. Linux users are slowly being pushed toward the edge of the modern internet, not because Linux is insecure, not because it is outdated, and not because nobody uses it, but because governments and corporations are redesigning the internet around systems Linux was never built for. And the scary part is that this is only the beginning. Most people think of the internet as one giant open space where everyone can access the same websites in the same way. But that version of the internet is disappearing. A new kind of internet is replacing it. One where every user must constantly verify who they are, what device they are using, how old they are, where they are located, and whether their system can be trusted. Governments call it online safety. Companies call it security. Platforms call it compliance. But underneath all those labels is a very simple reality. The internet is moving toward a future where anonymous, independent, and fully user-controlled systems are becoming a problem. And Linux represents all three. To understand how this started, you have to look at a wave of laws that began appearing around the world over the last few years. Governments became increasingly worried about harmful content online, especially content involving minors. Public pressure grew after years of social media scandals, online exploitation cases, privacy violations, and algorithm controversies. Politicians promised action. They promised to make the internet safer. And in response, countries started introducing laws that forced websites to verify the age and identity of users before allowing access to certain content. At first glance, most people supported these laws. The idea sounded reasonable. Protect children from harmful material online. Nobody wants children exposed to dangerous content. That is not the controversial part. The real issue is how governments decided to enforce these laws. Because once lawmakers started demanding online age verification, they ran into a massive technical problem. How do you actually verify someone's age on the internet? You cannot just ask users to type in their birthday because anyone can lie. So governments pushed for stronger verification systems. Facial recognition, government ID uploads, digital identity checks, device authentication, biometric scans, AI verification systems, third-party tracking services. Suddenly, websites were being pressured to collect extremely sensitive information from users. And this is where Linux users started running into trouble. Linux systems are fundamentally different from Windows and Mac OS in one important way. Linux is built around openness and user control. Users can inspect the system, modify it, remove components, block tracking, customize security layers, and reject invasive software. That flexibility is one of Linux's greatest strengths. But from the perspective of governments and corporations trying to build strict identity verification systems, it becomes a nightmare. Because these systems depend on trust. Not trust in the user, trust in the platform. Modern verification systems work best when companies control the hardware, the operating system, the browser, and the security environment all at once. That is why companies like Apple and Microsoft are becoming so important to governments. Their systems are centralized, controlled, predictable. They can enforce security standards directly at the operating system level. Linux breaks that model completely. A Linux user can change almost anything about their system. They can block scripts, disable tracking, spoof browsers, remove telemetry, alter kernels, use custom distributions, route traffic through VPNs, hide device fingerprints, use privacy-focused browsers, refuse proprietary software. From a freedom perspective, that is amazing. From a government verification perspective, it is terrifying. And because of that, Linux users are increasingly being treated like suspicious users by default. This started quietly. A few websites began requiring browser-based verification systems that failed on Linux. Some age verification providers simply did not support Linux browsers properly. Certain biometric tools required proprietary drivers unavailable on Linux. DRM-based systems refused playback. Identity checks failed randomly. CAPTCHA systems became more aggressive toward privacy-focused users. Most people ignored these issues because they affected a small percentage of users. But then the laws spread. What started in one country quickly inspired similar policies elsewhere. Governments around the world began discussing mandatory online verification systems. Some targeted adult websites. Others targeted social media platforms. Some focused on protecting minors. Others focused on misinformation or digital identity enforcement. Different countries used different language, but the technical direction remained the same. The internet was moving toward mandatory identity infrastructure, and Linux users were caught directly in the middle of it. Because Linux is not designed around identity enforcement, it is designed around user freedom. The conflict between those two ideas is becoming impossible to ignore. Think about what the modern internet increasingly expects from users now. Websites want your phone number, your location, your biometric data, your browsing behavior, your verified identity, your government-issued information, your device fingerprint, your authentication history. Some platforms even want constant behavioral monitoring to determine whether you are a real human. That is not the open internet anymore. That is a permission system. And Linux users have spent decades specifically trying to escape systems like that. This is why Linux communities are reacting so strongly to these new laws and technologies. To many Linux users, this is not just about inconvenience. It is about the future of computing itself. Because once governments normalize mandatory online identity verification, it changes the entire philosophy of the internet. The old internet treated users as free participants. The new internet treats users as authenticated subjects. That shift changes everything. It changes who controls access. It changes who owns data. It changes who has privacy. And it changes who gets excluded. What makes this even more dangerous is that most of these systems are controlled by private corporations rather than governments directly. Age verification is often outsourced to third-party companies. Identity checks rely on commercial APIs. AI moderation systems are privately operated. Cloud verification systems run through centralized providers. This creates a strange alliance between governments and massive tech companies, where both sides benefit from increased digital identification. Governments gain more control over online activity. Companies gain more user data, and ordinary users lose privacy. Linux users see this more clearly than most people because Linux culture has always been deeply connected to ideas of decentralization, privacy, transparency, and resistance to centralized control. Many Linux users deliberately avoid invasive ecosystems. They use open-source software, privacy-focused browsers, self-hosted services, encrypted communication tools, ad blockers, tracker blockers, alternative search engines, decentralized platforms. But the modern internet increasingly punishes that behavior. Websites break when trackers are blocked. Verification systems fail when scripts are disabled. Platforms flag VPN usage as suspicious. Privacy browsers trigger security warnings. Custom systems lose compatibility. The internet is slowly being redesigned around compliant users. And Linux users are among the least compliant users on the internet. The irony is almost unbelievable when you think about it. Linux powers huge parts of the internet itself. Most web servers run Linux. Cloud infrastructure depends heavily on Linux. Supercomputers run Linux. Android is built on Linux foundations. Networking infrastructure everywhere relies on Linux systems. The internet literally runs on Linux. But the people using Linux desktops are increasingly treated like outsiders. And the situation becomes even more disturbing when you realize how much of this transformation is happening invisibly. Most mainstream users do not notice because they already live inside tightly controlled ecosystems. If you use an iPhone, a MacBook, Windows 11, Chrome, and mainstream social media platforms, these systems feel normal. Verification works smoothly because your entire digital life already exists inside corporate-controlled infrastructure. But Linux users live outside that infrastructure. That is why the cracks appear first for them. And those cracks reveal where the internet is heading for everyone else too. Because once identity verification systems become normalized, they rarely stay limited to their original purpose. History shows that surveillance infrastructure almost always expands over time. Systems introduced for safety become systems used for control. Databases grow, monitoring increases, access requirements expand. What begins as optional eventually becomes mandatory. Linux users understand this pattern extremely well because many of them have spent years studying technology, security, privacy, and digital rights. They know how quickly centralized systems can become abusive. They know how dangerous it is when governments and corporations gain the ability to monitor large populations online. They know how fragile freedom becomes when access to information depends on identity verification, and they are watching the internet move directly in that direction. Even browsers themselves are changing in ways that worry Linux users. Modern browsers are becoming less like simple tools and more like controlled platforms. Browser vendors increasingly decide what technologies users can access, which extensions are allowed, what security rules apply, and how web standards evolve. Google's influence over Chromium-based browsers gives enormous power to one corporation over how the internet functions technically. Linux users traditionally relied on customization and flexibility, but browser ecosystems are becoming more restrictive every year. Ad blocking APIs change, extension systems become limited, web integrity proposals appear, anti-fraud technologies expand, fingerprinting protections weaken, device attestation systems get proposed. All of these changes push the internet toward one central idea: verified devices, verified users, verified software. That sounds harmless until you realize what it means for independent computing, because Linux is fundamentally about unverified computing, not unsafe computing. Independent computing. A Linux user can install whatever they want, modify whatever they want, inspect whatever they want, remove whatever they want. The system belongs to the user. That philosophy directly conflicts with a future where platforms demand proof that systems have not been modified. And this is why many Linux users fear something much larger than simple compatibility issues. They fear a future where operating systems that prioritize user freedom become incompatible with mainstream internet access entirely. Not banned officially, just gradually unsupported, step by step. One feature at a time, one verification system at a time, one restriction at a time, until eventually Linux users find themselves locked out of major parts of online life unless they surrender the very freedoms that made Linux valuable in the first place. And honestly, some signs of that future are already visible. Certain streaming services already limit Linux functionality. Some enterprise tools barely support Linux. Hardware manufacturers prioritize Windows and Mac OS. AI systems optimize for mainstream platforms. Security software increasingly depends on closed ecosystems. Online banking systems sometimes fail on Linux browsers. Gaming anti-cheat systems block Linux compatibility. Education platforms require proprietary apps. Workplace environments assume Microsoft infrastructure. Every individual problem looks small on its own, but together they form a pattern. The internet is becoming more centralized, more monitored, more restrictive, and more dependent on corporate-controlled identity systems. Linux stands in opposition to all of that. That is why this conflict matters far beyond Linux itself. Even if you have never touched Linux in your life, what happens to Linux users affects the future of digital freedom for everyone else too. Because Linux users are often the first people to notice when technology shifts toward excessive control. They are the early warning system of the internet. When privacy disappears, Linux users notice first. When platforms become restrictive, Linux users notice first. When standards become hostile to openness, Linux users notice first. And right now, they are noticing something very serious. The internet is changing from an open network into a controlled environment where identity, compliance, and platform trust determine access. The scary part is not that Linux users are being affected today. The scary part is realizing who might be affected next tomorrow.